Hi, and welcome back to the AP Music Theory crash course. Today is actually going to be the second to last video in this series, and we will be talking about melodic form and relationships. So let's get right into it. So first of all, a melody is a series of single notes that begins, moves forward, and ends. It has direction. It's also defined as a logical progression of pitches and rhythms, a linear succession of notes that form a recognizable unit, and not just a bunch of random notes. Keep in mind that by has direction, it means that it has tension, it has resolution, it has progression. An anacrusis is just the pickup note or notes that come before the downbeat, and it adds up with the last measure to form the amount of beats in one measure. Melody tends to have more conjunct motion than disjunct motion. Remember that that just means stepwise movement with notes rather than skips and leaps. The four most important notes that define tonality and mode of a melody are the tonic, since it shows you the tonic center and the key, and the mediant, which shows major or minor, the dominant, just because it's the fifth scale degree and it's used very often, and the seventh, because it adds tension and positions the melody for a return to the tonic. As for structure and form, a melody is constructed in phrases and always concluded with a cadence. Phrases usually occur in pairs when the first phrase ends with a weaker cadence and the second phrase with a stronger one. That is called an antecedent consequent relationship, and it's also known as a period. Most commonly, you'll have a half cadence and a perfect authentic cadence in an antecedent consequent relationship. When both phrases begin identically, or the second is a variation of the first one, it's called a parallel period. And if you have two parallel periods, that's called a repeated parallel period. Pretty self-explanatory. If they're different phrases, then it's called a contrasting period. When both phrases end with a strong cadence, there's no period. Phrase expansion is when you add material to the beginning via an introduction or a prefix, or a middle or the end. And repetition, there are many ways to repeat. You firstly have literal repetition, which is when you just repeat the same exact phrase over. You also have imitation, which is when it can be repeated in another part, imitating the first. So with motives, that just means 2 to 8 notes. Keep in mind notes, it's really, really short, that are repeated throughout the melody, a recurring theme that can be varied a lot later on. This is, for example, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You have the very obvious theme that comes up over and over, which is the da 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 theme, you know. This, I'm actually not really sure how to pronounce it, to be honest, but I think it's called the leitmotif, which means it's a motif associated with a person, a place, or an idea, and this is often seen in film scores like Star Wars, for instance, or operas. Like with the main character, it just comes up. A musical theme is a complete melodic phrase. This is 2 to 8 measures. It's kind of like a larger version of a motive. This is recognizable as a pattern and serves as the basis for expansion and variation. This should be basis, not bases. But variation, there are many ways to vary a motif or a theme. So transformation is when you just change the motif throughout. That includes fragmentation, which is when you have a part of a motif and it's repeated and varied in different parts of the composition. This can be through pitches. You just have to really keep the rhythmic structure sort of the same. Like, for instance, in Mary Had a Little Lamb, this is especially prevalent in the last 3 out of 4 measures here. So these two are all fragments of the second measure, you have 2/4 notes and a half note, and you just see that repeated but varied here. So melodic sequence is when you repeat the original motive, but when you start on a different pitch. The intervals, they don't have to be exact. They can be, but they can also just be diatonic instead of chromatic. Remember that diatonic means it's found in the key. Inversions, that's when you imitate, but you play the notes kind of upside down from the original melody, meaning you are moving in the opposite direction. So for instance, if you had like an interval where you go 3 notes up, then that would be 3 down in the inversion, or like each step up would be played as a 1 step down. If it's exactly that, that would be called a mirror inversion. A retrograde is when the melody is played backwards, like note by note, every single note is played backwards. A retrograde inversion is when it's backwards and it's inverted. A modulation is when you change keys, but they're usually still closely related to the original. We'll go back into this later on in this video since this is a pretty important concept. Ornamentation and embellishment, that just means when you add non-chord tones. This we will also go into like 2 minutes from now. Octave displacement is when you just place the notes of the melody into a different octave, whether it's an octave higher or lower. It's basically the same pitch, but in a different octave. Mode mixture, which is when you combine chords from parallel major or minor to increase harmonic resources, providing more variation. An example of this would be the Picardy third. Remember that when we mentioned it in a couple of videos ago, I think? That is when, like in a minor key, the third, instead of playing the minor third, you use a major third, which is found in the major key, the parallel major key, hence, the Picardy third. Rhythmic transformation is when you change the motive or the theme's rhythm. That's including augmentation, which is when the pitches, they remain the same, but each of them, the rhythms are equally lengthened. Diminution is the exact opposite of that. The note values are shortened by the same amount. And rhythmic displacement just means that you keep the same original rhythmic structure, but you move it to a different place. Like, for example, you start the phrase on the third beat instead of the second beat, or the first beat, I guess that would make more sense. So, non-chord tones. These are just notes that don't belong in chords, but they go between chords and they create a temporary dissonance. So here is a visual diagram to help you picture these. A passing tone, I think we might have mentioned this a couple of videos ago, but I'll elaborate all the same. This is when you just use a note between the two notes you're kind of you're kind of connecting. You have, for example, here the E, F, G. This would be the passing tone. This usually occurs on the weak beat, but it can also be accented, which I will describe really soon. And you can also have neighbors, which means it just, for upper, it's 1 step above the 2 chords you're trying to connect. So a lower neighbor would be the opposite, and here's an enclosure. This one isn't actually used too often on the AP, but it's good to know. There are actually so many non-chord tones, but you have to know most of these. Oh, for suspensions and for anticipations, these are actually supposed to be tied over, but they don't really show that here. It can also not be tied over, but you will mostly see it tied over since it's meant to be held. So before I mentioned the concept of something being accented, for example, with a passing tone, that just means that it occurs on the beat when it's not really supposed to. Like for non-chord tones, most of the time it goes on the off beat. Not sure if that's what you would call it, like the weak beats. Usually they go on the weak beats, like for example, the second or the fourth beat, simply because they're really connecting to chords, which tend to be more important, hence the strong beats. But if it's accented, then it occurs on the beat. Note that the appoggiatura is like the one exception that always occurs on the strong beat, so it's always accented. A chromatic passing tone is when you have a note with an accidental connecting two chords one whole step apart. The two chords are one whole step apart, so the passing tone would be like in between them. An incomplete neighbor is a general term. It's a non-chord tone with a skip, what am I saying? A skip in one direction and a stepwise motion in the other direction. This usually occurs in a weak rhythmic position. You'll also have, oh yeah, like I mentioned before, suspensions and anticipations are meant to be tied, but when it's not, it's called a re-articulated suspension. Retardation. This is a suspended note that resolves upward. This comes up a lot in multiple choice questions. You just want to remember the term since it can be kind of confusing as the name of it is like completely unrelated to what it actually does. So key relationships. Mode mixture, like we mentioned slightly before, that is when you combine chords from parallel major and minor keys using the minor third, sixth, and seventh. You'll see these with capitalization or lowercase of Roman numerals in the figured bass. And if the root is altered, you will also see accidentals placed before it to show it. Likewise, you'll also have the symbols for augmented, which is the plus sign, and diminished, with which is the degree sign. So remember those, they will show up in the free response question quite frequently. As a general rule, you want to resolve chromatic alterations down. So modulation, this is a pretty confusing topic, I guess, but it's something that you have to know. It's when you shift the tonal center to a temporary new tonic. It's pretty likely to be present if you're seeing a lot of recurrence of the same exact accidentals. It usually occurs with closely related keys, as I mentioned before, from the original key, because they usually share common diatonic chords. The key signatures generally differ by no more than one accidental, like hence they're closely related. So modulation keys usually include the relative major or minor, the parallel minor from major, the dominant and the subdominant. Remember, that's just the fourth and the fifth from that. Or a key with one more sharp or flat and its relative major or minor, and a key with one less sharp or flat and its relative major or minor. So here is a visual that might be helpful for you. It just shows that if the home key or the original key we're talking about here is A, then the closely related keys to A would be D, since it's 1 degree flatter, you would say, and it's also only one accidental less. And you also have E, which is one accidental more. So with D, you have its relative minor. Yeah, all of these are just the relative minors to the major, and these are also the closely related keys to A. So there's a total of 5 here that you should generally know. So you might want to keep this diagram in mind. You can recognize modulation through cadences or by hearing unusual pitches that are not in the key if you're listening to it. So now let's move on to secondary function harmony. This sort of relates to the idea of modulation that we just talked about. Chromatic harmony is the study of secondary dominants and leading tones. Any major or minor chord can serve as a temporary tonic, a secondary temporary tonic that is, but augmented or diminished chords cannot, so you have to remember that. Dominant function, it has a strong pull, and any chord with dominant quality can function as a secondary. And any accidental resolving upward by a half step would be a leading tone relationship, and a temporary shift to a new tonic. So when you see that, when you see an accidental resolving upward by a half step, just keep that in mind. It's probably a shift to a new tonic and a leading tone relationship. If the accidental is a raised scale degree, it's usually the third of a fifth or a 5/7 chord, or it's the root of a diminished seventh chord. If it's a lowered scale degree, it's usually the seventh of a 5/7 chord or a leading tone seventh chord. Note that a half diminished leading tone chord resolves to a major tonic, whereas a fully diminished leading tone chord resolves to a minor tonic. And this is also an example of mode mixture, which is, as we mentioned, when you mix the minor and major notes of parallel major and minor keys. Resolution tones in a secondary dominant or a secondary leading tone are generally based on the temporary tonic, not the original one. So you definitely want to keep that in mind when you're writing in your FRQs. And that'll be all for today's video. I know this was kind of a complex topic. You might want to review it through, I know there are many FRQ practices that you can access on the AP website. So yeah, that'll definitely come in handy. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the last video, hopefully tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.